You're listening to the Journey Podcast. In this profound episode, we share the inspiring story of a single mom who found the courage to persevere through life's challenges. This episode contains adult subject matter, and some listeners may be triggered by this content. Listener discretion is advised. Hi, I'm Petra Brunbauer, and with decades of experience with sadness, pain, anxiety, and stress, I finally figured out how to leave all that behind. And this podcast shows you how to break free permanently so you can reclaim your sanity and find the self-esteem and energy to go after the life you desire. With real talk about mental health, holistic healing, and the tough journey of coming out the other end. This is the Journey Podcast. Welcome to today's episode. In this heartfelt episode, we delve into the world of single parenthood, stress, anxiety, and the journey of healing and growth. Our guest, a remarkable individual, shares her deeply personal story of navigating the challenges of single parenthood while simultaneously coping with the profound loss of her parents. Her inspiring journey also touches on the pursuit of her dream, the establishment of a yoga and arts space, a testament to her resilience and determination. Through our engaging conversation, we hope to shed light on the incredible strength and courage it takes to face life's tribulations. By embracing vulnerability and harnessing the power of healing practices, our guest exemplifies the transformative potential that lies within all of us, offering valuable insights and inspiration to anyone navigating similar challenges. Abby McLachlan is the founder of East of Eden and has lived in Walthamstow since 2011. Before opening the studios, she'd been in the music and media industries for 15 plus years. When she became unexpectedly pregnant, that career was no longer viable long term, not as a completely solo parent, and she started to dream of opening her own yoga and art space and naming it after her favorite book, East of Eden, by John Steinbeck. In 2014, she met a yoga teacher who was up for giving it a go, and the first one-room mat studio opened in Hatherley Mews in 2015. After crowdfunding on Cedars in autumn 2015, they took a neighboring studio and opened a bigger mat studio plus reformer Pilates in 2016. Her business partner left that year. Then in 2019, after 2 years of negotiating, Abby signed a new lease with Waltham Forest Council in October 2019 to add better facilities, a cafe, and new studios downstairs. Despite a build riddled with difficulties, finally in March 2020, everything was finished and life looked good, except for the news about a new virus called COVID-19 circulating around Europe. A week after the grand opening, the brand new studios closed as it became clear a national lockdown was coming and everything shifted online. The studios managed to fully reopen and then in July 2022 expanded to open a new reformer Pilates studio plus a bar and hot yoga space. A year on, the next expansion will add spin and better therapy rooms to open in January 2024. Here is my interview with Abby McLachlan. Hi, Abby. It's so great to have you on the podcast today. I've been looking forward to getting to chat with you because coping with stress, anxiety, and grief as a single parent is such a profound and important topic for today's episode and in today's world in general. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Petra. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. And do you want to share a little bit about yourself and who you are and where you've come from and what you're doing now?
Of course. My name is Abby McLachlan and I live in Walthamstow and I'm the founder and owner of East of Eden, which is, I guess, boutique fitness and yoga studios and a cafe in Walthamstow at the end of the Victoria line. I've been doing this for 9 years in March, and actually my background is music industry, but when I got unexpectedly pregnant with my son in 2012, my world really changed. I had been planning to start an MSc in international development in October 2012. I'd been pretty keen to get out of music for a little while, and I felt that international development would offer the challenge that I was looking for. But obviously, finding out that I was pregnant, I was no longer with his dad, who had decided he didn't want to be involved, it changed things. And in October 2012, when I was meant to be starting my MSc, I was actually having a baby. But interestingly, the things that I'd done in order to change my life and set myself up to be a student again, so to not have much money and to be changing careers and starting from scratch, those changes that I'd made in my life also helped me with being a single mum and having a baby completely on my own. So October 2012 came, I had my son, and I did end up going back to work when he was about 6 weeks old, but I went back to work in music and I consulted for a bit. And I started to think of other ways that I could change how I earned my living.
Wow. It sounds like quite the journey that you have undertaken. And I do understand that being a single parent is very challenging, and it has challenges of its own that some other families don't experience. So when you went back to work in the music industry, did you find that challenging in terms of work hours and taking care of a newborn and trying to fit that all in?
Yeah, no, it was challenging. I mean, I was pretty lucky. Part of the reason I went back when my son was so little was because I had a contract with Napster, who were based in Germany. And so I was already home officing at a time when nobody was home officing. So
Right.
they were able to give me a 2-day-a-week contract when he was tiny. And actually just going back to work, even though he was really small and it felt honestly completely overwhelming at the time, it wasn't like going back 5 days of work into an office. So it felt like the contract itself was too good to turn down. If I hadn't gone back and taken this contract when he was 6 weeks, I might have ended up a year old having to go and work full time in an office somewhere in central London. So I went back 2 days a week when he was 6 weeks old. And then I upped it to 3.5 days when he was 6 months old. And I was lucky enough to find a nanny share with a family that lived down the road. I realized pretty quickly that I couldn't look after a baby and do a job. So by the time he was 2 months, he was being looked after at home by somebody here. So I could still breastfeed and I could still kind of be around, even though I was also working. I mean, there was a lot to think about. There was a lot to juggle, but I also feel at the time there was a certain amount of simplicity because I was literally only focusing on my newborn baby and then the work that I was doing. And actually, in many respects, it was the following year when my son was over a year old and I decided to look at opening this yoga studio as an interesting way of changing my career and being able to manage my hours more effectively. That's when things got complicated because I was doing my full-time job. I was trying to look after my son, who by then at a year old, is running around and definitely requires a lot more input. Plus, I was trying to set up a new business. And I'd say at that point, things started to get pretty complicated.
Yeah. And by what I've seen on the internet and what you've told me, you didn't just found a small yoga studio, although it may have started off as that, but this has grown into an amazing project that you have stamped out of the ground, and you have created this and brought this to the community. So what was that like, trying to grow this business while you were a single mom? And did you face challenges around mental health and emotional health as you were trying to wear these different hats of being an entrepreneur and being a mother and still trying to make all that work?
Yes, absolutely. Actually, when I started the business, I did have a business partner. She was also a single mother and she was looking after the yoga side of things. And then I was running the business side and the marketing. I actually ended up buying her out a year later. So she wasn't in the business for very long. But I would say that first year was probably the most challenging year of my entire life. Not only was the workload just incredibly intense between my day job, running the studio, and looking after my child, I would end up having her child as well, who was about 6 months older than mine. So he was maybe a year and a half, and my son was 2 when the studio opened. He'd get dropped off at 6 a.m. She'd go and teach. She'd come back and pick him up at 8:30. I'd do a day's work. And then in the evening, her son would be back at mine. So it really added an extra level of complexity. She decided she didn't want to be a part of the business anymore. She had some mental health problems herself. So I think it was a very tricky separation for both of us. And that year is the first time I've ever experienced the symptoms of physical anxiety. I mean, we all have anxious feelings at different times in our lives, and to be worried is a normal part of the human range of emotion. But that kind of anxiety where you physically shake and you feel sick, and the first thing you think when you wake up is that the bottom is dropping out of your world. I'd never really had that before, but I think I just felt so vulnerable being in business with somebody who didn't really want to be in business with me. And I hadn't really kind of explored the true depth of what it means to go into a business partnership with somebody. It's like being married, but you don't necessarily have those feelings of love and affection that you presumably do when you marry somebody. So that was an incredibly tough year. When I bought her out, we had expanded the initial expansion. So I should just take a step back here, Petra, and say that when we first took the studio, it was just a single room. We had 20 mats. We had an IKEA shelving unit at the back of the room with the mats and the props in. We had a cash box, a sofa outside. And then we did a crowdfunding campaign on Cedars, which is an equity crowdfunding platform. And we expanded to take the next door office, did a big building project to turn that into a beautiful light-filled yoga studio full of plants and a living wall, kind of an urban Eden. And obviously the studio is called East of Eden. And we added Reformer Pilates into the original studio. So that work had already happened and our costs trebled overnight. But unfortunately, the revenues took longer to catch up. So that process of the business partnership failing and the expansion all happening in 2016 was incredibly tricky for my mental health. And I would say at the end of that year, I had bought my business partner out. So it was just me running the business. But it felt to me that there was a good chance the business wouldn't succeed. And for all of 2017, I really just got my head down and I worked really hard. I also felt an element of guilt at still being there running the business when I'd bought my business partner out, but I was also still just responsible for Rafi. And I think just that combination of being solely responsible for the business, the stress of trying to bring the money in and trying to turn it into a really viable economic business, but then also still having 100% responsibility for my son and the worries about potentially losing everything when it's just me and the buck stops with me. It was incredibly difficult. And actually, I'd say the one thing when I look back is that my parents were so unbelievably supportive of me that year. And I just don't think I would have got through it without them. I was earning so little money that I'd go into the local shop and I wouldn't be able to buy coffee. And in hindsight, it was a really, really tough time. And I feel like I only really got through it with my mental health intact by the skin of my teeth. But things started to improve a bit the following year. The revenue started to come in. People started to come to the Reformer studio. And I was working in the background on getting a new lease from the council to take the space between the studios. I sorted that out in 2019. So it was a couple more years. Then went into a 6-month build where I spent all my money developing brand new studio spaces, a wonderful cafe, new facilities, new treatment rooms. So excited about reopening in 2020. And of course, the doors open on March the 10th, 2020. And a week later, they close again because of the COVID lockdowns.
Yeah.
That took me up to 3 years ago. And in many respects, I would say, circling back to the original question about running all this as a single mother, in a way that having my son and being on my own with him, that didn't feel like the most difficult element. It was adding in the business and the interpersonal relationships and the stress around the making the business work and the possibility of losing my home if it didn't work. That on your own is really hard.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned that you had great supporters in your parents. And what other things did you do to cope with that stress and anxiety during that time? Because you're right, it starts affecting our mental health. And especially when we're talking about big existential anxiety, like losing a home or losing a way to clothe and feed your child, those are big issues. And how did you cope with all of that? Did you find anything in particular that helped?
Well, prior to opening my own studio, yoga had always been my go-to. It was the thing that I did in order to help me still my mind and just get perspective, the moving meditation. But then suddenly with the studio opening, the thing that I did in order to escape or manage the stresses of the day to day, that became the source of all of my stresses. So my relationship with yoga became more complicated, I would say. One of the things I've always done to kind of escape is just to get out into the forest. I live in Walthamstow. We've got the beginning of Epping Forest near here. And when life feels overwhelming, I get into the trees. And in terms of yoga, I try to practice outside of the studio because, like I say, when the thing that you do for your stress relief is also the source of your stress, it does make things complicated. So therefore, I try to make time to go to other places and practice in other studios. And then I also just tried to spend as much time as possible with my parents because they really understood me. And even though they weren't based in London, they were based in South Wales. The support that I got from them, I think, just really enabled me to get through this. And it was also wonderful watching their relationship develop with my son. At the time COVID happened and the lockdown in 2020, he was 7 years old. You know, I really drew upon their support. And I'm also lucky enough to have my sister in Walthamstow. We both have ended up in the same place. So I lent a lot on her for moral support as well. So I suppose in answer to your question, it was connections of family, particularly friends as well, but particularly family. It was getting out into nature. And then it was also keeping up with my yoga practice and trying to separate out the stresses of the day-to-day business from what I got from the practice itself.
Yeah. Yeah, yoga is such a wonderful modality and an approach to life. So I can definitely see how that can be supportive in instances like that. Now, you made it through the pandemic, thankfully, and you were able to reopen afterwards. But you did have some heavy, heavy losses in your family because you lost your parents. So how did that journey continue for you?
Yeah, so COVID was really difficult for my mum. My mum and dad lived in Wales. My dad was blind and always said if he hadn't met my mother, he would have been a hermit anyway. And my mum was very different, very outgoing, traveled a lot, was always abroad. She worked in education. She was the head of early years at the local university in Wales. And she'd always be doing random twinning things or going to the education departments of universities abroad. She was a social butterfly, loved being out and about. Hadn't had the easiest time in her childhood and upbringing either. Her mum was put into an asylum when her sister was born, probably because of postnatal depression. Her sister was given to a milk nurse, so a wet nurse at the time, and like a foster family it would be today. And my mum went to live with her ancient aunts. This was in the mid-40s. And when my mother and her sister and her mother came home, my grandmother had what today would be bipolar, but then they didn't really know what it was. I think my mum said people called it manic depression, but that was probably even a bit later. So my mum didn't know if her mother would be smashing plates or buying caravans. It was one or the other. Her dad wasn't really around. I think her dad was, I don't know if she necessarily had a very good relationship with him. And anyway, when I was 3, my sister was 1, my mum went over to her mother's house. So this is obviously a lot of years later, but this manic depression or now bipolar has continued through her whole life. And she found that her mother had killed herself. So my mum had to deal with her own mother's loss. And I think one of the big ways she coped with that was by being this big personality and being social connections and feeling needed and important. And anyway, COVID came, and overnight, all of the things that helped her manage her own mental health were taken away from her completely. And my mum aged pretty quickly in a very short space of time. She was in her mid-70s when the lockdown happened, coming up to London, jigging about, being at the studio. People always thought she was 10 years younger. And when I saw her for the first time after the lockdown 6 months later, because she was so nervous about the virus, she looked 10 years older. And she didn't die from COVID, but she had something called amyloidosis, which is an immune condition, an immune response condition. And it's basically where your body can't clear away the light chain proteins, which we all have. And basically our body kind of clears away. So they build up. And when they particularly go into the heart and build up around the heart, your heart just gives way. And that's how people die with amyloidosis. It's quite rare. Charlotte Church's dad actually has got it, even though it's quite a rare thing. I remember reading about that. Anyway, my mum had that. In a normal year, she probably would have been treated and she hopefully would have survived. But unfortunately, with the COVID restrictions and all of the issues around the NHS at the time, and she just didn't get the treatment, and she was hospitalized through malnutrition in January 2022, and she died 6 weeks later. And she wasn't expected to die. She was told the day before she died that she would be released from the hospital she was in Wales. She was no longer considered to be an acute patient. But her anxiety spiraled that night. She didn't want to be released into this other hospital. And she had a heart attack that night and she died. And it was actually, I don't know, funnily enough, 2 years to the day since we had reopened the studios after our big 6-month build, only to close them again for COVID. And it was such a shock, really, because she hadn't been ill for long. She only got the diagnosis of amyloidosis at the end of November. By the January, she was in hospital, and then by early March, she was dead. And it was particularly difficult for my dad. I think he had PTSD from the night of her death, particularly. As I said, he was blind, and the hospital did call him to say, we think you might have to come in early in the morning. They actually woke him up at the time that they called. They then called him back and said, oh, no, it's fine, don't worry. And then they called him back again half an hour later and said, no, come now. But by the time he'd got a taxi, he was too late. She'd already died. Nobody came in to see him. He was sat with the body for 2 hours. And I think for him, I don't think PTSD is too strong a word for his experiences that night when Mum died. And then he's on his own in the house in Wales. And he did really well for a bit. He hung curtains on a steep stairwell, balancing the ladder. I don't know how he did it. He reseeded the lawn. He got someone in to put a new flooring in the garage so he could put his cross trainer in there. My dad was a really resilient, and he was a really impressive man, incredibly fair, incredibly passionate about social justice. But I think for him in the end, it was just too hard to live without my mum. And he had a massive heart attack about 4 months later, and he was found in the garden. Yeah, it was a massive loss for me. As I say, I don't know if I would have survived in terms of my mental health that first bit of the business and all of the upheaval around my business partner and just the stress of doing it on my own as a completely lone parent. My parents really helped me in so many ways. And then they never got to see the studios that I reopened in March 2020. They never came back up to London after Christmas 2019. They've never seen what I've done since. I've since taken another studio and created a bigger, brighter reformer studio. I've just started a new build now, which will be open early 2024. That's adding spin. My mum never saw the cafe. My mum would have loved to have sat in there drinking coffee and chatting to people. And my dad would have been fed up and wanted to go home. And he would have been so proud too. I know he would have been. They both would have been. I also just feel sad for what they've missed in terms of my son. And my sister has 2 children as well, a 12-year-old and a 9-year-old now, and my son's 11. And there's so much of their lives they've missed. So, yeah, it's really sad, and I miss them all the time. I also recognise, I have to say, how incredibly lucky I was to have them for this long. Many people don't have this. And the one thing we all know about life is that one day it will end. And I suppose that actually for my dad, while it was a devastating loss and I miss him more than I can say, it was incredibly hard for him, life without my mother. And I remember him always saying, you want a long life and a quick death. And even though I think they were both cheated out of their last years, they also met their grandchildren. My dad wouldn't have wanted to have lived for a long time without my mum. I think he felt disloyal to her, even coming out for dinner with us sometimes. For him, my mum was everything. And like I say, he always said that had he not met her, he probably would have been a hermit.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that incredibly difficult journey with us and with our listeners. And as you're telling your story, I'm sure there are many listeners who can relate, who may have also lost loved ones, lost parents. And how did you cope with the loss of 2 such important people in your life as you were running your studio, reopening, trying to get that going again, and still being a single parent? Did you find solace in nature and in yoga as you had before, or was this different for you?
To be completely honest with you, Petra, I actually really struggled with my yoga practice after their death. I mean, look, you can go to a yoga class and it can feel like a beautiful stretch for the body and you don't really engage with the bigger kind of holistic spiritual nature of it. But I think for me, yoga has always been bigger than that. And you kind of meet yourself in yoga. And I didn't want to meet myself that much. It was just too big. Like the loss was too big to be able to go into a yoga studio and potentially fall apart within the studio, because the movement and the kind of moving meditation and the practice, for me, I connect with this bigger spiritual presence. So I actually pulled away from yoga in the immediate aftermath of both my parents dying. I found more solace in slightly more mindless, even though it's still mindful, reformer Pilates, you match breath to movement in the same way. For me, it was the put the music on loud, do some functional movement that requires me to work hard, where I can't really think about anything else. And actually, the day that I found out my dad had died, both my sister and I went and we did the really tough reformer class. It was the only thing we could do because I felt like my anchor to the earth had been cut, completely severed, especially with the loss of my dad. It's like your world's foundations have been pulled out from underneath you. And actually, in those early days with both the losses, it was only exercise that anchored me back to the earth, just temporarily. So yes, that's definitely the forest, just being in the forest. And I have a dog, and being able to get into the forest and walk her, that was incredibly helpful. You mentioned the expansion of the studios, and I'd actually put the offer in on the new space for the reformer Pilates studio towards the end of 2021, because the Citizens Advice Bureau in Walthamstow, who were the tenants in the office, they'd messaged me privately to say they wanted to leave. Did I want to take the space? And I'd said yes. And then by the time the council had kind of pulled themselves together and said, right, we're ready to offer you a lease, it was a couple of weeks after Mum had died. And I said, I'm not ready. I can't do this right now. For the first time ever in any of my dealings with leases and expansions at the studio, I took a step back and I didn't try and push things. I didn't try and push it forward. But it's kind of like, this expansion, that lease seemed to have a bit of a life of its own. And without me really doing anything except hiring a solicitor to liaise with the council, I suddenly in May, end of May, had a message saying, well, we're ready to complete. Would you like to go ahead with this? And I thought, wow, this has been really easy. Usually it's been months of stress and anxiety and chasing people and push, push, push. And with this, for the first time ever, it felt like there was some flow. And I was obviously just trying to deal with my grief around the immense loss of my mother. And I thought to myself, well, I guess, yes, let's do it. It felt like reformer was a bit of the business I should be investing in. And actually, since it's exploded in London, there are so many reformer studios. Even yoga studios are converting their biggest yoga spaces to reformer studios. So in hindsight, it was probably the right decision. But it also felt to me like whatever happened with the cost of living crisis and all of the other economic uncertainty, I was already kind of in it to such an extent with the size of my leases that this wouldn't be the thing that kind of tipped me over. And it was structurally connected to my unit. There were really good reasons to go ahead. So I said yes, pressed the button. We did an aesthetic piece of, we basically went in and decorated, put new lights, mirrors, cleared out the carpets, proper floors in. And then I thought, I'll take my time to develop the rest of the space. And then we opened, and a week later, Dad died. So it was actually really bizarre how the whole agreement of the lease and the expansion and the work required to get it up and running seemed to sort of slot into this period of time. And then obviously Dad died, and that was it. I was floored and I lost interest, really. I just really struggled to stay engaged in any way, shape or form. So coming back to your question about how I cope with it, really, I just tried to focus on the here and now, and movement definitely really helped. Getting into the forest really helped. And then also spending time with my son as well. Although that was also a double-edged sword, because my dad died the very first day of the summer holidays. And so whereas usually he would have gone to school and left me time, suddenly he was there all the time, and he'd hear me crying from upstairs and come rushing down to comfort me. And while it's important for children to understand that grief is a part of life and that grief is just love, and it's okay to see people crying. I also didn't want him to feel like he had to take responsibility for me either, because he was only 9 at the time. That was a really difficult period. I don't know. I look back and I'm not quite sure how I coped with it all, to be honest. But you just put one foot in front of the other sometimes, don't you?
One day at a time. Yeah. And you touched on something really important, just that you said that you took a step back also after your mother passed. And I find that sometimes when we have a lot of grief or even stress or anxiety, we tend to push through because we think that's what's expected of us. And very often we don't listen to what we need or what our body is asking us to do and take that step back. So very, very important thing that you mentioned, where I think those are the times where we need to look after ourselves. We need to make the time for ourselves to grieve and to put ourselves back together and not think that we have to do it all, not think that we have to push through and do everything at that time. So, yeah.
I completely agree with you there. The one thing that struck me was the physicality of the grief. It's exhausting and you feel physical pain. And I just had no idea. I guess I'm really lucky. I've gotten to my 40s and I've lost people, friends, but that personal, someone so close to you, it's a very different beast in my experience. And I think it really took me by surprise. And you're right, you do have to nourish yourself and give yourself time just to process it. But also for me, I found I also had to lean into the feelings a bit as well, because while I talked about how sometimes I had to move my body and just put the music on loud and do a class, there were other times I just needed to sit there and allow myself to cry and howl in a dark room, because if you don't allow yourself to feel the feelings, you just become numb to all emotion in life. And none of us want that to happen either. So you have to allow the feelings in so that they can pass through you, I suppose.
Yeah.
You have to honor the feeling.
Yeah. Give yourself that time and space to experience that. Yeah, absolutely. And very often, all of those very negative emotions can affect us physically, and people even sometimes develop chronic pain out of grief and stress and anxiety. So those are very real things that can start affecting, how we function or how we show up in daily life, and can make things very, very challenging. So thank you so much for sharing all of that. And I can tell that you have been through so much, and yet you still look after your son and you run the studio. So thank you very much for being here and for sharing that story and for everything that you do to bring all of these opportunities to your community. I think it's beautiful and wonderful. Now, outside of the Pilates and the yoga that you offer and the cafe that you have, are there any other programs or services that listeners could tune into where they could connect or they could meet you or they could work with you if they're looking for working with you in their own journeys?
In terms of the physical location, I touched earlier on upon the expansion that we were doing at the end of 2023. The launch will be beginning of 2024 to add ride. So this is rhythm cycling, spin studio. I'm really excited about this. I started researching spin probably about 6 months ago, and the endorphins that I get from it, just that complete switching off of all other feelings except the being in the dark room, the music, the sweat, getting your heart rate up. There's something so powerful about it, I think, especially when you do it in a group space. I am really passionate about music, of course, and I just can't wait to get some incredible soundtracks. We're going to offer drum and bass ride. We're going to have full-on pop ride. We're going to have all sorts of different music themes. We're going to have 26 bikes, a mirrored ceiling, lights that move in time to the music, as well as some rides that are slightly more chilled, less sensory overload. We have some customers that come along who have vertigo or for whom it just is a bit intense to have flashing lights. So we're going to have a real mixed offer for people who come to the studio. As a demographic at East of Eden, we're a really broad demographic. I really want the studios to reflect the broader Walthamstow community. And so therefore, I also want to have rides for people that are a bit older, where perhaps you have just 30 seconds of speeding up and then you drop back down. So we're really going to look at carefully crafting an offer that really complements the rest of the East of Eden offer, but also is accessible for all of our community, including community pricing for all classes. Just because, again, circling back, I want the studios to be accessible and inclusive. As well as the stuff that we do within the East of Eden studios in Walthamstow, we also do a fair bit of outreach. We work with the council. It's a summer-based program usually where we offer full moon yoga and gong in the town square. We've also done it for solstice, where we had 487 people come along of all ages, all backgrounds, all religions, and everybody moved together on the longest day. Those sorts of collaborations for me are so important, because that's how we kind of get out and make the studios a really inclusive offer. At the other end of the scale, we also work with the Natural History Museum. So we're there usually the last Sunday of every month. We offer yoga and gong under the blue whale skeleton. We've been there for 6 years in April, with obviously a break for COVID. And they are amazing events. 6 years in, it never gets old to walk into an empty, dark museum and switch on the lights and offer these beautiful practices to 150 people surrounded by billions of years of natural history. It literally never gets old. And then we also have an online library. So if you ever want to connect with our teachers or some of the practices we offer, you can always do that remotely. All of our classes in the main Math studio are live streamed, so you can always join those classes. You can, however, also go to our library and have a look at some of the pre-recorded classes. So yeah, lots of opportunities.
Amazing. It sounds like that's a wonderful community and a wonderful studio that you have created. And these events are amazing. So I highly recommend that listeners check that out. And if you are based in England or around London, then you can go in person and check out some of the events as well. And we will be linking to all of Abby's offerings in the show notes as well. So be sure to check there on the link to the studio and the live offerings and her events. Well, this has been another incredible episode, and I really hope that our listeners have enjoyed our journey into coping with stress, anxiety, and grief as a single parent, and listening to Abby's story and journey as she has come through all of that to today. I really, really immensely enjoyed myself, and thank you so much for sharing all of that. It has been fantastic chatting with you on the podcast today, Abby. Thank you so much for your time and your wisdom that you brought.
Thank you so much, Petra. I've really enjoyed chatting to you. It's been a really lovely, almost therapeutic session with you today. So thank you so much for listening.
Yeah, it has been my absolute pleasure. And thank you again for being here and sharing this with our listeners. And I hope that many of them connect with you in person also, and then know that when they've listened to this episode, they know how to get in touch with you. Thank you so much, Abby. Take really great care of yourself and have a fantastic day.
Thank you so much, Petra. Bye.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen in. If you enjoy the Journey podcast, please support us by subscribing, sharing on social media, and leaving us a review. We appreciate you. And you can find more of The Journey on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and our website, thejourney.com. Sending you love and courage, and see you next time.